Thank you very much. So my name is Melissa. I am an engineer here with Kipcon. Been with Kipcon for a couple of years now. My background expertise is in site work, so everything but the building. So today, as we move through this presentation, I am going to use as my example a pavement project. Of course, there are many types of projects that this process would apply to. So if you've got a roofing project or if you've got a drainage improvement project, siding, HVAC, anything of that nature, this process would apply. So today we're going to be talking about several different topics from soup to nuts. We're going to be talking about the parties that are involved and what their roles and responsibilities are in the arc of the project. We're going to talk about the process, the documents. We're going to touch on bidding. We're going to dive in a little bit to some details on bidding, what contract administration is and is not. We're going to talk about how to, in the end, touch briefly on how to minimize risk. And that really falls into the importance of the contract documents. So again, this type of approach falls into the category for any of these types of projects that you would have. Clearly, largely our client base is homeowner associations, and these are the types of residential projects that come up typically in the cycle of the life of the community. So why would you do a project? So everybody, hopefully, if you are in a community association, you are having a reserve study prepared, having it regularly updated. So you should be funding for projects so that when it comes time to do the project, you're largely funded for that project. Now, just because your reserve study says it's time to redo roadways or siding doesn't necessarily mean that. So you want to take a look. They may be in age appropriate condition, meaning that it might be time to do a project, but you want to take a look at their overall condition before you dive right in and do a project. Obviously, construction, labor and materials are becoming more expensive. So people are being a little more selective on when they do projects versus maintenance. So sometimes though it might be an upgrade. You might want to not use a certain material anymore. One of the types I can think of is a lot of communities have wood tie retaining walls. And when they replace those retaining walls, they might go for a segmental block. The maintenance is lower on them. You don't need to constantly worry about water seepage through them and rotting, things of that nature. So clearly there are other reasons to do a project. There might be damage because of nature, fire, unfortunately, or other unfortunate events. So sources of funds, obviously I touched on reserves, which is a large source of the funding for these types of projects. If there's not enough money in reserves, there may be a special assessment. You may need to borrow money to do the project. If it's imperative to do the project and you need to get it done, borrowing might be something that is an option. Insurance comes into play when there is damage, there's fire, or a car accidentally runs through the front of the building. It happens. And that's when insurance would come into play if you have that coverage in place. So let's talk a little bit about who the parties are involved. Now, of course, there might be more parties involved in a project, but these are the three big ones. Usually the community association, who is oftentimes represented by the community manager. Sometimes it is a board member. It depends on what the dynamic is. There's the community association attorney, also who plays a part at the contract level. The association's engineer, who will prepare the plans, who will put things out to bid, and who will administer the contract in the end. And we'll talk about that more later in the presentation. And obviously the contractor is the party who performs the work. So in these relationships, there are direct relationships and there are communication relationships. So the engineer works directly for the owner. And the contractor also works directly for the owner. So there is however, there's a three-way communication channel, even though the contractor and your design professional, be it an architect, engineer, HVAC designer, they both have separate contracts with the owner. However, the communication line needs to be open between all three during a project. So again, with community associations, the representation, the owner's representative is largely the community manager or someone on the board or on a committee, perhaps. Your design professional, again, is the one who puts together the specifications. We're talking about that today. And then the contractor, of course, is responsible to execute that project. So again, you're going to have a separate contract with your engineer and your contractor. So this is often a point of confusion when we come to the point where an association selects a contractor. And I will often be sent the contract. I'm as an engineer, I'm often sent the contract between the association and their contractor and asked to review it. I'm not the person who should be reviewing, or your engineer is not the one, or your architect. That should be reviewed by the association's attorney. Again, the contractor is contracting directly with the association. The engineer has nothing to do with that relationship, although the engineer is involved in the project. So you want to have your attorney review that contract and not your engineer. Now, the specifications that are prepared by the engineer become an attachment to the contract between the contractor and the association, because that is the scope of work that the contractor is going to be executing. So that becomes part of the contract. So what is the purpose of a contract? So they define clearly, or as clearly as possible, the relationships between the parties. So usually the contract is, it's long. There's many pages to the contract typically. But when there's a problem, that's when people consult the contract. What does the contract say? What does it say about who's responsible for injuries, or providing the materials that are specified in the contract, or installing those materials? Who's responsible to obtain the warranty on those items? So the contract spells these things out, should spell it out as clearly as possible. So the engineer, as I mentioned, has a separate contract with the owner. What does that contract usually entail? So that contract starts at the beginning of the project. The owner will call and request a proposal for, again, we're going to use our example paving project, and they'll say our pavement has reached the end of its useful life. We would like to do a mill and pave project. We'd also like the catch basins repaired if they need repairing. We'd like curbing that's damaged to be replaced as well. There may be speed humps involved. There may be several things that are involved with the roadway project. So the engineer will give a proposal to the owner, which, if they accept it, will then become the contract between the owner and the engineer. So the scope of services that are typically included in that contract are, of course, the preparation of the construction documents. So there are typically drawings, and then a separate project manual that has written specifications in it, and oftentimes the bid form as well. Cost estimates. I will tell you that if you're planning on taking the specifications and doing a project, putting it out to bid right away, there's no need to prepare a cost estimate. Sometimes we're asked to prepare a cost estimate, but if you are putting a project out to bid, you are going to get actual costs. It doesn't matter what our industry price-based cost estimate says. What the cost of the project is what the market will bear, what the contractors return in their bids. So if you are taking the specifications and having us go right out to bid, or taking it and going out to bid yourself, that is the cost of the project. So having a cost estimate done and spending money on that is not necessary. And then also there will be an option for contract administration. And I won't go over that here because we're going to touch on it later. But these are the three big phases of an engineer's scope of services, preparing construction documents, bidding services, and contract administration. So what should be in the contract? So there should be a scope of work that is clearly described for the pavement project. What is going to be done for the pavement project? Number one, typically we're going to come out and review the site, walk through with the owner's representative, whether that be a board member, a committee member, or a community manager who is familiar with the issues. The contract should say what that's going to cost for us to come out and do that and prepare the specifications and attend any meetings that might be involved in that scope of work. What is the schedule of the work? So every company is different. During when things are busy, you usually will contract with an engineer, and they will let you know what the schedule is for preparing the items in the scope of work. If there's a dispute, how do we resolve the dispute? So that's often in the contract as well, in the terms and conditions. If there's additional work, if the community decides they want to add something on mid-project, how does that work? Also the limits of liability. So there's oftentimes once you engage with the engineer, insurance information will be exchanged in case there's an injury, some unfortunate event. What are the terms? Who is responsible? How will that be resolved? So again, getting back into what the deliverables are. So during specification preparation phase of a project, we're preparing the construction documents. Again, what we're preparing at this stage is going to become part of the contract with the contractor that the association has chosen. So that will typically include the design drawings and the project manual that has the written specifications in it and the bid form. So what is the purpose of the design drawing? So they're a graphical representation of the work that needs to be done. If you are having architectural work done, obviously you will get a set of architectural plans that will graphically, and in some cases verbally, a page of notes describe the work that is to be performed. And if you're doing again, in the case of our pavement project, you're going to get a set of specifications that graphically show the areas that are going to be where the work is going to be done. It might call out specific areas that need repair before any other of work can be done, such as if catch basins are in bad shape, there might be a call out on there that talks about areas of different catch basins that may need the heads and the grates changed out because they're the wrong type, or because there is deterioration that needs to be addressed before the project can proceed, such as curb work or any sort of repairs, mortar repairs inside catch basins, things of that nature. So also, if a project is phased, the phasing will be shown on the contract drawings. So if you're going to do a multi-year project, it'll show which areas are going to be done in the first year, second year, so on. So specifications, also known as written specifications or the project manual, is just that. It is a manual that is a written manual. It has different sections in there that have to do with, number one, the description, a verbal description of the project. Why the project is being done. This is directions to the contractor. It's not just the contract drawings. The project manual is part of the project that the contractor will be provided in their bid packet. They're to read through and be familiar with what's in the project manual. So it'll have a verbal description of the project. The second portion is often the bidding portion. There's directions to the contractor in there as to who they should return their bid to. Is there going to be a walkthrough? Is the contractor allowed to go make arrangements to visit the site? So all that would be explained in the project manual. There's also a bid form in that project manual in the bidding section for the contractor to complete and return. And this becomes the basis of the cost of the project. So though those bids will be returned to who's ever collecting the bids and put into a bid summary so you can compare bids across the scope of work. And I want to add that having specifications prepared by an engineer or an architect or whoever the design professional is very important, because when you're putting a project out to bid, you want to have every contractor bidding on the same scope of work. And oftentimes, if somebody calls us up and hands us a stack of bids and says, which one should we choose? I don't have an answer, because they're typically all based on different scopes of work. All the contractors have a different opinion of what should be done. So having specifications prepared is an organized approach to not only project execution, but bidding as well, because the contractors are bidding all on the same scope of work. So you can actually make a valuable comparison between all of them. Also included in the written portion of the specifications are additional specific terms and conditions that have to do with the specifics of the project. Any warranties that the contractor is offering, if there is any sort of manufacturer warranty that might be involved, such in a roofing project, how does that work? How is that executed? Even right down to where a contractor should be storing his materials, where the facilities for the workers should go on site, and what condition at the end of each day should the contractor leave the site in? Because can he leave equipment anywhere? Can he leave mud on the pavement? Things of that nature. It's usually that the site needs to be in broom clean condition, any hazards clearly marked or cordoned off. So all of that is specified in the project manual. One of the things I want to point out is that the specifications and the contract drawings are not intended to define means or methods of construction. So this is often a point of confusion. Again, your engineer has a different sort of contract than the contractor does with the owner. So the contractor is responsible for the means and methods of construction, meaning that the engineer does not tell the contractor, is not responsible to tell the contractor how to construct something. The engineer tells the contractor through the documents what needs to be constructed, what needs to happen where. As the project proceeds, the contractor is responsible for making that happen, meaning that any the crews that they use, the equipment that they use, the way they take the materials that are specified and install them, that is the responsibility of the contractor. And again, also we touched on this when the RFP, or request for proposal, goes out. Within the bid package is the advertisement for bid. It's got a summary of when the bids are due. Again, if there's any pre-bid meetings, oftentimes a community will want to do a group walkthrough with contractors. Sometimes they will allow contractors to come to the site when they're comfortable doing so, or if they want to have a look at the area before they provide a bid. And that's all spelled out in the RFP. And again, instructions to bidders. When should those bids be returned? Whom should they be returned to? If the contractor has any questions or concerns about the documents they've been sent, who should they contact? Who answers those questions? And also how to submit the bid. Should they be in electronic form? Are hard copies required? Oftentimes there is a bid proposal form, as I mentioned. There's a certain format for the bids that need to be, the contractor needs to use that form. That's a requirement of the bid return. And also the certificate of ownership, and also certification that that contractor is licensed to do the work that they are proposing to do in that state. Sometimes with certain projects, certifications are required. For example, with roofing, with certain types of roofing materials, they the manufacturer will require a certified installer to install those materials. A contractor that has been trained in installing their certain brand of materials. So if that certification is required, that needs to be submitted with the bid package as well. There are some other items that are often a requirement for larger projects. Not all projects, if a project is smaller, such as bond bond amounts, things like that, are typically not required for smaller projects. They're short-lived projects. There is typically not a question that the contractor is not going to be able to finish the project, so those bond requirements are not there. Some other items, again, I won't belabor these because we have more material to get to. But again, if there are, say, retainage, when a contractor finishes a portion of the project, they submit the invoice. There's usually a retainage, an amount that is held back and not required to be paid until the whole project is done. So that could be 8%, 10%, are common retainage amounts. Also, we request with the RFP, what is the project schedule? Now that oftentimes can't be submitted with the bid. It is dependent upon when the project is awarded. So we ask that the contractor provide a schedule upon award. So when that project is awarded, the contractor will, and that contractor's contract is in place, they can provide a schedule of when the work will be done. And oftentimes it's contingent upon weather. So even though for external type projects, such as our pavement project we're talking about, obviously that is dependent on weather. So on a rainy day like today, that schedule might change because you can't pave in the rain. Again, insurance requirements are often spelled out in the general conditions section of the project manual. We talked about bond requirements that these are usually for larger projects, so I won't touch on that here. Indemnifications, I mentioned that earlier. If any party is sued during the course of the project, or damage or injury occurs, who's responsible for that? How does that work? All right, let's talk about the bid form. So I don't think I have, yeah, I don't have a copy of the bid form in here, but I want to point out that the bid form has two general sections to it, and one is for the base bid, and any costs that are provided for the base bid are those costs associated with work that we know needs to be done as part of a project. So using our pavement project as an example, the base bid would include milling the surface course off and putting new surface course back on. We know that is the basis of the project that needs to be done. Now, there's also another section in the bid package that has to do with unit pricing. So that has to do with types of work that may need to be done, but we don't necessarily know yet if they need to be done. But unit pricing will often include items that are typical to certain projects. So for a paving project, for example, what might not be included in the base bid, but you still want prices for in case it comes up, or if there are any base repairs. We don't know if there are asphalt base repairs required until we mill that top surface off. But if we do encounter that, what is that going to cost the association? So on a per square yard or square foot or linear foot basis, those unit costs, we ask for those unit costs from the contractor so that if we do encounter those certain types of conditions, you'll have a cost basis for that. And again, especially for the base bid, we will include the quantities based on the specifications that were prepared so that the contractor, when they bid on it, they're all bidding on the same thing. 3,000 square feet of asphalt, 1,500 linear feet of curb, whatever is in that base bid, all contractors are bidding the same so that when you compare them, you can make a reasonable comparison. Um, okay. So now there are different types of costing methods. Sometimes in the base bid, items may be included in there as a lump sum. Sometimes they are quantity based. I just mentioned, so many square yards of asphalt, so many linear feet of curb. So those are unit cost based. Sometimes there are items in there that are lump sum. So it's not based on um, a linear foot or area quantity. It's to do X, you're going to charge a lump sum. For example, there may be a try to think of an example in a pavement project. Oftentimes, at the end of a project in communities that have granite block curb, there are grout pointed joints between each of those curbs. And sometimes after 30, 40 years of use on a roadway and salt use, that those joints are deteriorated. So oftentimes we'll ask the contractor for a lump sum, not a linear foot cost, because we want them to go through the whole community and repoint those areas between the Belgian blocks. So we'll ask for a lump sum amount for their contractor to come through at the end of the project and repoint all the joints in the curb that are deteriorated, clean them out, put some new grout in there. And so the contractor will say, we can do that for, $1,500 or $5,000 or whatever it is. It's a lump sum. So time and materials, this often comes up on projects that have also maybe some unknowns in them. Once you open something up, say for example, there is we're doing a siding project, and they take the side once they take that siding off, we're looking for areas where there may be um, some rot behind there. We don't know what the scope of work is until we take that off. So we ask for time and materials. So for what type of materials they are going to use, framing members, sheathing members, how much will those materials cost? Also labor. It takes somebody to come and actually remove the deteriorated materials and put in the new ones. So there's a labor cost involved. So we'll ask for prices for those. Also in the general conditions, I mentioned any guarantees or warranties. So on a pavement project, we'll typically ask for in the project manual in the warranty section a 1 year warranty for any sort of workmanship related issues on projects that the contractor will cover. Sometimes communities might want a longer warranty period, and they are certainly welcome to ask the contractors whether they are willing to consider a longer warranty period. Sometimes with pavement projects, the contractors willing to consider a longer warranty period of maybe 2 years. I will tell you that if you start right off with requesting a long warranty period, you may get contractors that decline to bid. You want to give the contractor the option of extending the warranty, and oftentimes they will. I found that with pavement projects. So just a little tidbit to know. Also, in the general conditions, I touched on this, what is the communication? I always ask at the beginning of the project that if there's any sort of communication between any of the three parties while the project is in progress, that everyone is copied. It is very important to not leave any of the parties that are involved out of that communication. That's how information gets lost and confusion happens. So always keep that line of communication open between owner's rep, engineer, and contractor. Also, if there's any permits or inspections involved, I know that being involved with a lot of stormwater basin refurbishment or repair work, if you're disturbing a certain amount of area within that basin, you may need to get a permit for that disturbance. Also, if you are with drainage projects, if you are need to connect to, say, a municipal catch basin that's in the municipal right of way. You can't just go and have your contractor do that. You need to alert the township. They may require a road opening permit. So it's very important to talk about what permits may be required. I will tell you that the contractor is responsible to obtain any permits for the project. So oftentimes our specifications will clearly say that the contractor is responsible to obtain any permits that are required for the work. So the contractor will go to the township, they'll say this is what we're going to do, or the building department, fill out the appropriate applications. If the permit is required, they need to obtain that permit. Also important, who is responsible for the cost of that permit? So that should be very clearly spelled out as well. I will tell you with site work, there's also another condition that needs to be considered, and it is if you encounter any materials that are hazardous in any way or need special disposal considerations, such as when you're working in a detention basin, everything in your community, road salts, motor oil, everything flows into that detention basin. So when you're removing sediment, you can't just take it and dump it anywhere. You have to have certain level of testing done, and you need a permit to remove that contaminated material, potentially contaminated material from your site. So I just want to make you aware that it's often not just a time of a case of we've hired a contractor, now we're ready to go. There are oftentimes permits that are required to proceed. Oops. So once you have sent your items out to bid, you've submitted your RFP, you've gotten your bids back. What happens next? So you need to select your contractor. So once you've gotten those bids back, if you're working with an engineer, you're having bidding services done, will often give you a summary in the form of a spreadsheet, so you can see across the board each of the items, each of the steps of the project, how much that's going to cost. So when you need to select your contractor, what are you selecting your contractor based off of? So you want to look at maybe past experiences with the contractor, the reputation of the contractor. If you're working with a professional engineer or architect, the contractors that are on the bid list are often contractors that they do work with regularly and they know that they do quality work. So when the RFP is about to be submitted, we will send you a list of contractors that are on that bid list. And we ask that if you want to remove or add any contractors, you're certainly welcome to do that. There are contractors we may not have worked with, and this comes up quite often where a property manager, say, for example, has worked with a contractor that we're not familiar with or haven't worked with, but he or she has had a wonderful experience with them and would like them to be included on the bid. We can certainly add them to the bid list. There are rare occasions where, for whatever reason, they want a certain contractor removed from that bid list. So when you're getting that bid summary back, it's usually a curated list. So those contractors are on that bid list for a reason. Either your engineer or the owner has had a good experience with them. So we talked about the pre-bid conference. So when for some projects, some communities like to schedule one date where all of the bidders that were invited to bid come and they do a walkthrough of the area, and they're allowed to ask any questions they want. They can, and we always encourage if there are any sort of value added features that a contractor can add to a project. They're certainly welcome to do that. Oftentimes there are cost saving suggestions that a contractor may have. I can think of one particular example on a drainage project where we were putting in some trench drains, and the contractor, and it was in a non-vehicle area, it was in a pedestrian area, and the contractor had a suggestion of a product that he had used on several other projects that was very successful, suggested that product during the walkthrough. The owner agreed, the engineer agreed, and we used that product product on the project. It was a um, kind of trench drain that it was all in. It was kind of a packaged sort of apparatus that was used very nicely in a pedestrian area. So we used that on the project. It turned out very well. So sometimes allowing the contractor to visit the site or doing a group walkthrough can bring up some ideas that were not initially considered, and they can be incorporated. Now, once all the bids are received, those bids need to be analyzed. So if you're working with an engineer, we're going to look at those bids. We're going to look for any sort of anomalies. So sometimes I look at a bid list and I can see that there are outliers, either very, very high bids or very, very low bids. And that can happen for a number of reasons. But especially with low bids, I like to be careful because the low bids can be very, very attractive, but that does not necessarily mean that that's your best option. So when I see a low bid come in, I will contact the contractor and go through with them and ask them if this is they're comfortable with this bid, and if they want to take another look at it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Now, bids can be low for a number of reasons. It can be a contractor who really wants to get the work. It could be a contractor who does not understand the scope of work. So you want to be very careful about low bids. Um, Okay, and as I mentioned, you want to take the opportunity to confirm that the contractor is clear on what is in the bid package. If they've got any questions or need any clarifications before you go to contract, that's the time to ask those questions. And that's the same for the owner. If the owner has questions for the contractor, that is the time to clear things up. Okay, let's talk about contract administration. So once you've selected your contractor, I just want to back up a little bit. Once you've selected your contractor, you're going to ask them for a contract for you to execute. Again, the engineer, that's a separate contract from what you have with your engineer. So when you're contracting with your contractor, you want to have your attorney review that. So you want to make sure that you're protected as an association. And again, that's the time to ask any questions when you are in that contract negotiation phase. So if something goes wrong on the project, how does that get resolved? So that's and many other types of questions that come up. And then once you have your contract in place and you're ready to start the project, the contract has given you the project schedule. You will often rely on, if you've contracted with your design professional to perform contract administration, that's the time to bring your engineer back in. When the project is going active, the contractor's going to go out in the field and start work. So I want to talk about what contract administration is and isn't. So again, the contractor is responsible for the means and methods of construction. So again, they are responsible for their crews, their equipment, how things are constructed. The engineer's role in contract administration is to make sure that what is specified in their contract drawings and in their project manual is getting done. Are the catch basin repairs getting done? Are the curving replacements getting done? Is the workmanship good? Does it meet the specifications that are in the design? When the pavement is milled, or is the base course being repairs being properly identified and properly executed in conformance with the contract. So that's what the engineer is out there to do. We're comparing the work that is being done to the specifications. Also, during contract administration, the role of the engineer is important in that if there's any interpretation needed to be done, you try to cover all your bases generally when you're putting together a design for a project. But there may be questions that come up during that project. We had one yesterday that I can think of on a pavement project. There was between us preparing the specifications and the work being done in the field, there was a pipe issue where a pipe went underneath a roadway. It had deteriorated, and there was a it had done some damage to the curb and the roadway. It was repaired, everything was repaired, but there was a new condition out in the field. And when the contractor came upon it, there was a question as to whether they were responsible to repair that curb. We decided that this was the best time to do it, and would they please add it to their contract. Now, keep in mind, it wasn't part of that base contract, but we had unit costs for removal and replacement of curb. So there was a little more involved with it, but the contractor was able to go through and repair that. So if there's again, if there's additional work, just as I mentioned, the engineer can take a look at that and decide whether it's needed or not. When the contractor submits their invoices for payment, how would the owner know whether that's ready to be paid or not from a construction standpoint? So your engineer can review those invoices. We compare them to the bid documents, the original bid documents that were submitted by the contractor, because keep in mind, those bid documents become part of the contract. So when they submit an invoice, we're looking to see, did the base costs align with what the original bids were for the base cost? And the work for any extras, does it align with the unit costs that were submitted at the time of the bid that became part of the contract? And the retainage, does the retainage, the amount that your client is going to hold back until the end of the project, does that align with the contract? So that's what we're looking for when we are looking through the invoices. And then if everything is in alignment and we're in agreement, and we're in agreement with the quality and the conformance of the work, we will authorize the owner to go ahead and pay that invoice. I will tell you, during construction, construction is a messy, dusty process, especially for site work. So oftentimes there are punch list items, not because the contractor is doing bad work, but because that's just what happens during the course of a project. And when you're working with a quality contractor and they have a warranty in their contract, that contractor, especially in the HOA world, my experience, wants you to be happy with the finished product, quite frankly. So if there are punch list items that it's very common for those items to come up. In the case of a pavement project that I'm using as my example, there may be areas where you might have a little bit of ponding, especially on flat sites where everything is paved, and there may be some areas that need to be massaged a little bit to get that water to move. So that will go on the punch list. It's an area of concern, and the contractor will come in and do something to satisfy that punch list item. So that's very, very important. Again, I want to reiterate, your engineer is not there to supervise, and they're not responsible for means or methods. So how can you reduce costs? So as I mentioned, everything's getting more expensive. The cost of labor, cost of materials, the cost of remediation projects is increasing. How can you consolidate costs? If you have multiple projects, again, using my pavement example, you may have some concrete work in the community that you've been meaning to do. A lot of times, community will um, put together a pavement project with a concrete project. Say, for example, the sidewalk ramps in their community are deteriorating. They want to before they do the pavement projects, they want to make sure that these ramps are as they should be. They're safe. Maybe you want to add some detectable warning surfaces. Maybe your township is requiring you to do that. So you consolidate that project and you have it all done as one project. That's a way to kind of save on having two separate projects designed, two separate contractors come in. You can consolidate that. In some cases, not all projects, there might be incentives or rebates. This is often the case with any kind of upgrade that has to do with HVAC or any kind of weatherization projects. There may be some programs available that will give you either reduced cost or a rebate on that. If you are upgrading material, I'll just touch on this last point on the slide here. You want to look at the long-term cost. So if for example, here I'll use a retaining wall. That's a nice example. So if you are replacing your wood tie retaining walls with segmental block, the initial cost of installing that segmental block retaining wall may be greater than continuing to maintain the old wood wall or replacing it with another wood wall material. But when you look at the long-term costs of that, when you look at what you're spending on maintenance every year versus over say 10 years, 20 years versus replacing that wall now and spending the money to replace it with long-lasting, low-maintenance materials, and you look at that cost over the long term, you'll see that it is lesser than what you would have spent trying to continually maintain something that is a headache or a high maintenance item. So that's important to consider as well when you are looking at the cost of projects. The initial cost isn't always the issue, it's the long-term cost. And I see this with pavement a lot too. Um, and I understand communities want to maintain their asphalt for as long as possible, but there comes a point when the age of the pavement has, and it could be just totally age-related deterioration that's happening. It reaches a point where the cost to maintain it and to keep it from deteriorating further, it just becomes egregious and it's time to replace it. So you want to consider that in your cost as well when you're considering whether to do a project or not. Okay, so how do we minimize risk? How do we minimize misunderstandings and cost overruns, things to that nature? So you want, again, you want to clearly understand the roles of each party. You want your contracts to be clear. Who is responsible for what? In the event of injury, in the event of having to make field decisions, who's responsible for that? So you want your contract to be clear on these items. Again, I want to point out that the engineer has a separate contract with the owner than does the contractor. They serve two separate roles, but you want to keep communication open during the project. Everybody should be included during an active project on communication so there's no misunderstandings. Also, the low price isn't always the best alternative, and I talked about this earlier. So you want to, especially when you get a low bid, you want to look at unit costs. They become important because if a contractor is giving a very, very low cost on a base bid, you want to look at their unit costs because they may be planning on scopes of work outside of the base bid that they are relying on making their money on. So this happens in certain situations. So again, when you get that low bid, you don't only want to look at the base bids, you want to look at the unit costs as well. They're very important. If you see that, again, just to reiterate, unit costs are for items that may happen outside of the work that you know that needs to be done. So for example, base repairs. Say pavement is in very, very poor condition. You want to pay attention to the unit costs for removal and replacement of deteriorated base course, because that may become a major item, a major source of change orders in your project that you want to keep an eye on. So always look at the unit costs. And you want to establish payment terms that protect you as well as an association. So that retainage amount is important. when does that retainage get released? That's an important consideration as well. So typically that retainage gets released once all the punch list items are satisfied and are taken care of and addressed in some way. So you want to make sure that your payment terms are based on completed work only. I want to reiterate, though, sometimes a contractor will require a deposit upfront to start work, and that should be clearly spelled out in the contract. So if that has been agreed upon and there's a certain amount that's required, may say a third required to start the work, that should be spelled out clearly in the contract. There may be no cost to start the work, and it may be based on just simply completing the work in each phase as you go along. So you want to have that clearly established. Okay. Um, that concludes my presentation. We can have a Q&A session if anybody has any questions. You can type them right into the chat. So let's see. So let's see what I've got in here. I have a question here. All bidders walk through with owner together. Um, all right. So it depends on how your bid services are set up. So you don't necessarily have to do that. You can, but you need to establish that in advance before you put out your RFP. So as I mentioned, there's an invitation to bid that is sent out. And there, if you're choosing to have a specific date where all the contractors meet with the owner, you can have your engineer present if you choose to. Again, that should be spelled out in advance in the scope of work. And you can have a meeting that's a walkthrough meeting, and again, where any questions that come up, any value added suggestions can be brought up at that time. Um, so you want to establish that in advance. Also, when in the invitation to bid, if you are not going to have a walkthrough, you may want to allow the contractors to come and take a look at the area where the work is being done. And if that's the case, who should they contact to do that? Who should they notify that either A, they're going to be on site, or if it's a gated community, they'll obviously need to be let in. But they should always let somebody know that they are going to be coming to the site to do that. Who should they contact? Um, let's see, another question here. Who is responsible if the engineer misses work or problems? I'm not really sure what the again, I think this comes back to communication. I think the only way an engineer would miss what's being done is if the contractor did not communicate that to them. If there was a problem during construction, it needs to be communicated clearly to the engineer so that decisions can be made. Sometimes the contractor needs to have a conversation with the owner and the engineer, especially if it's a problem, an unforeseen condition that needs some decisions to be made on it. So yeah, communication is very important. So I don't know if that's answering your question or not. If there's a more if specific way you can ask that, I'm happy to answer. Um, Engineering design and contract administration are needed for most large-scale capital reserve projects. How does Kipcon reflect these in their reserve studies? That's a great question. So, engineering design, when we include our costs in the reserve studies, if you read the note, especially for the items in that reserve study, the components that typically require engineering design, such as pavement, roofing, siding, things of that nature, we include a contingency in there to cover the cost of engineering design. And oftentimes, I mentioned those unit costs, things outside of the contract. We include contingency amounts in there that are typical to those types of projects. For example, the pavement project, there is a contingency in there for the engineering design and for anything that might be outside the contract, like base repairs, um, or poor subsoils, things of that nature. So what we do is we look historically at pavement projects that what we have done, and the costs are based on that. We look at what is typical for pavement projects, and I will tell you that usually somewhere between it's a wide swing depending upon what your condition your pavement is in, but sometimes typically between 10 and 20% over the base bid is what is required for work outside of that base contract. So we use 15%, and that's a kind of a middle of the road, and that gets worked into the costs in our reserve studies. Um, Contract administration, again, those that's not typically considered in a capital reserve study, because that's not always chosen. So that would be a cost outside of that and beyond what is in your reserve study. All right, that looks like all the questions we have. Does anyone have any questions before we conclude? We just have a few minutes left. All right. Thank you for attending today. If you are here for CEU credits, right in the chat there is Jennifer and Chelsea's email address. You can simply email them and they will send you your certificate or even a copy of the presentation if you would like one. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.